Welcome back, traveler. It's so wonderful you're here with me tonight. Tonight, we're journeying to one of the darkest places in all of wizarding history, a fortress that strikes terror into the hearts of even the bravest witches and wizards. So settle in, let your mind relax, and let us dive into the chilling depths of Azkaban. Far out in the icy waters of the North Sea, shrouded in mist and hidden from all maps, both magical and mundane, there stands a fortress that represents the very worst of magical punishment and despair. This is Azkaban, the wizarding prison that has haunted the nightmares of magical folk for centuries. But to truly understand the horror of Azkaban, we must travel back through time, back to its very beginning, back to when this island fortress was nothing more than the private lair of one of history's most twisted dark wizards. The story begins in the 15th century, sometime in the 1400s, when the wizarding world was still fractured and unregulated. There was no Ministry of Magic yet, no international statute of secrecy, and magical folk lived in a dangerous balance with the non-magical world. It was during this time that a wizard of unknown nationality but undeniable power decided to create his own private sanctuary, far from the eyes of both magical and non-magical society. His name was Ekrizdis, and he would become the architect of a nightmare that would endure for over 600 years. Ekrizdis was not merely a dark wizard, he was something far worse, a practitioner of the most vile and terrible forms of dark magic imaginable. Historical records suggest he was quite possibly insane, though whether this madness preceded his terrible acts or resulted from them remains unknown. What is known for certain is that Ekrizdis possessed extraordinary magical power he used to create or enlarge a small island in the North Sea, transforming it into his own private domain. Upon this island, he constructed a fortress, a dark and imposing structure that would eventually house horrors beyond imagination. The fortress itself was built with dark magic woven into its very foundations. Ekrizdis surrounded his creation with powerful concealment charms, ensuring that no map, whether created by wizards or muggles, would ever show its location. The island simply did not exist as far as the rest of the world was concerned. This perfect isolation gave Ekrizdis exactly what he desired, a place where he could practice his terrible craft without interruption or discovery. And practice he did for many long years. What Ekrizdis did within those walls remains largely a mystery, one that perhaps we should be grateful has never been fully revealed. What is known is that he used his magic to lure Muggle sailors to the island. These unfortunate souls, drawn off course by enchantments they could not understand or resist, would find themselves shipwrecked upon Ekrizdis' shores. There they would discover not rescue, but something infinitely worse. Ekrizdis tortured these muggles, using them as subjects for his dark magical experiments. He murdered them slowly, apparently for pleasure, learning from their pain. How many died on that island will never be known. Dozens certainly, perhaps hundreds over the course of his life. But the Muggle sailors were not the only victims of Ekrizdis' cruelty. Within his fortress, something else was taking shape, something that would prove even more terrible and long-lasting than his direct acts of murder. The fortress became infested with Dementors, those wraith-like creatures that feed on human happiness and leave only despair in their wake. The exact origin of these Dementors remains one of the great mysteries of magical history. Some magical theorists believe they may have been drawn to the island by the intense suffering and dark magic that saturated every stone of the fortress, breeding and multiplying in this perfect environment of misery and death. Others have suggested that Ekrizdis himself might have somehow created them through his terrible experiments, though this remains unconfirmed and purely speculative. The Dementors themselves are among the most feared creatures in the magical world, and understanding them is essential to understanding the true horror of Azkaban. They are not alive in any conventional sense. Rather, they are what magical scholars call amortal beings, creatures that were never truly alive and therefore cannot die. A Dementor appears as a cloaked figure, hovering slightly above the ground as if gliding through the air. Beneath their tattered black robes, if one is unfortunate enough to glimpse what lies there, one would see greyish, slimy-looking skin, scabbed and decayed like something that has rotted in water. Their hands, when they emerge from their cloaks, are skeletal and terrible. But it is what lies beneath the hood that is most horrifying, for there resides something worse than any physical appearance could convey. Dementors possess the ability to drain happiness from their surroundings. Simply being near a Dementor causes ordinary witches and wizards to feel cold, to experience a creeping sense of hopelessness and despair. The air itself seems to thicken with misery. Plants wither, water freezes. The world becomes grey and lifeless. This is merely the passive effect of a Dementor's presence, the ambient horror they spread simply by existing. But when a Dementor actively feeds, the effect is far more devastating. A Dementor feeds on positive emotions, on happiness, on hope, on every good memory a person possesses. They suck these things out, leaving their victims with nothing but their worst memories, their most traumatic experiences, their deepest fears. Prolonged exposure to Dementors, as prisoners in Azkaban would experience, causes progressive deterioration. First comes depression, a crushing weight of hopelessness. Then comes the loss of identity, as happy memories that define who we are get stripped away. Eventually comes madness, as the mind, left with nothing but horror and pain, simply breaks under the strain. Many prisoners of Azkaban, over the centuries it operated, died this way. They simply lost the will to live, gave up, and wasted away. But even this is not the worst thing a Dementor can do. The most terrible weapon in a Dementor's arsenal is what has come to be known as the Dementor's kiss. This is not a kiss in any loving or gentle sense. Rather, it is the ultimate horror, a fate considered by many to be worse than death itself. When performing the kiss, a Dementor clamps its mouth over its victim's mouth and literally sucks out their soul, consuming it entirely. The victim does not die. They remain alive, breathing, their heart beating, but they are completely and utterly gone. What remains is an empty shell, a body without consciousness, without thought, without any spark of the person who once inhabited it. There is no known cure for this condition. It is, in every meaningful sense, the end of existence, and yet the body lingers on, a horrifying testament to the Dementor's power. So these were the creatures that infested Ekrizdis' fortress. They bred there, multiplying in the darkness, feeding on the terror and despair of the muggles Ekrizdis tortured within those walls. For decades, perhaps even for centuries, this continued. Ekrizdis lived out his life on that hidden island, practicing his dark arts, surrounded by his Dementors, leaving a legacy of horror that would shape the wizarding world for generations to come. And then, eventually, Ekrizdis died. We do not know how he died, whether from old age, from some magical accident, or perhaps at the hands of one of his own creations. But die he did, and with his death, the concealment charms he had placed upon the island began to fade. Slowly, over months or perhaps years, the island became visible again. It appeared on magical detection spells. Wizards flying over the North Sea began to sense something there, something that had not been there before. Or rather, something that had always been there, but hidden from their awareness. Eventually, The Ministry of Magic, by this time the governing body of Britain's magical community, became aware of the island's existence and decided to investigate. The teams sent to explore Ekrizdis' fortress must have been brave indeed, or perhaps foolish. What they found there horrified them beyond measure. The official records state only that those who entered refused afterward to speak of what they had discovered inside, suggesting that the horrors were simply too terrible to put into words. Dead bodies, certainly, the remains of Ekrizdis' victims, dark artifacts and evidence of unspeakable experiments, and of course, the Dementors. A large colony of them had taken up residence in the fortress, and they had no intention of leaving. Those ministry officials would later note that the Dementors were the least frightening thing they found on that island, which speaks volumes about the other horrors discovered there. The ministry faced a dilemma. The fortress was clearly a place of evil, steeped in dark magic and human suffering. The logical response would have been to destroy it, to tear down the walls and cleanse the island of its darkness. But there were problems with this approach. First, the Dementors. These creatures were already known to the wizarding world, already feared. They were powerful, impossible to kill, and extremely dangerous. Experts warned that attempting to destroy the fortress might anger the Dementors, might drive them to attack the mainland. No one knew how many Dementors inhabited the island. No one knew what they might do if their home was destroyed. There was another concern as well. The fortress itself had been built with dark magic, constructed by a powerful and insane dark wizard. Buildings created with such magic often developed a kind of sentience, a malevolent will of their own. Experts in dark magical structures warned that Azkaban, as the island had come to be known, a name derived from a mixture of Alcatraz and Abaddon, meaning place of destruction or depths of hell, might wreak its own revenge on anyone attempting to destroy it. The walls themselves might lash out. The magic woven into the stones might resist in terrible and unpredictable ways. Faced with these dangers, the ministry made a decision. They would leave the island alone. The fortress would remain standing. The Dementors would be allowed to stay, unmolested and unchecked. It seemed, at the time, like the safest option. The island was far from any population centers. The Dementors seemed content to remain there. As long as no one disturbed them, they posed no immediate threat. And so, for many years, Azkaban simply sat there, a dark and terrible place, gradually fading from public consciousness as people tried to forget it existed. This situation continued until the year 1718, when a new minister for magic was elected. His name was Damocles Roll, and he had risen to power on an anti-Muggle agenda, capitalizing on the anger many wizards felt about being forced to hide their magical abilities following the implementation of the International Statute of Secrecy in 1692. Roll was an authoritarian figure, known for his sadistic tendencies and his harsh views on law and order, and he saw in the abandoned fortress of Azkaban an opportunity. At the time, the wizarding community's approach to imprisonment was decentralized and problematic. Small wizarding prisons existed in various towns and villages across Britain, but these facilities posed security risks. When prisoners attempted to escape, as they frequently did, their magical struggles often produced bangs, smells, and light shows that risked exposing the wizarding world to Muggle notice. The ministry had been making plans to construct a purpose-built wizarding prison on some remote Hebridean island, a modern facility that could safely contain magical criminals without risk of exposure. But Damocles Roll had a different idea. Why build a new prison, Roll argued, when a perfectly good fortress already existed? Azkaban was remote, far from Muggle populations. It was already protected by powerful magical concealment charms. and most importantly, it came with its own guards. Guards that required no payment, no supervision, no care whatsoever. The Dementors could serve as wardens. They would keep prisoners subdued through their very presence, draining away any hope of escape, any will to resist. It was, from a purely practical standpoint, an efficient solution. It would save the ministry time, money, and resources. Of course, there was opposition to this plan. Many wizards and witches, particularly those who understood the nature of Dementors and the history of Azkaban, protested vehemently. They argued that using Dementors as prison guards was inhumane, that it constituted torture. They pointed out that prolonged exposure to Dementors would drive prisoners insane, would destroy their minds and souls. They warned that this approach to punishment was barbaric, that it violated basic principles of justice and mercy. But Raoul was not interested in justice or mercy. He was interested in control, in punishment, in making an example of those who broke wizarding law. And so, despite the protests, Raoul's plan was implemented. Azkaban officially became the wizarding prison of Great Britain. Prisoners began to be transferred there, initially just a trickle, but gradually increasing in number. And true to the warnings of those who opposed the plan, none of the prisoners sent to Azkaban emerged unscathed. If they were not already mad and dangerous before being imprisoned there, they swiftly became so. The Dementors fed constantly on the prisoners, draining their happiness, their hope, their very humanity. The prison operated with a grim efficiency, and because no one ever escaped, because the presence of the Dementors made escape essentially impossible, the ministry considered it a success. Some years later, between 1733 and 1747, a new minister for magic took office. His name was Eldritch Diggory, and unlike his predecessors, he actually visited Azkaban to inspect the facility. What he saw there horrified him. The prisoners were not being rehabilitated or even simply contained. They were being destroyed, slowly and methodically, by the constant presence of the Dementors. Diggory saw human beings reduced to shells, saw minds breaking under the relentless assault of despair. He witnessed the sheer misery and insanity that the Dementors induced in everyone imprisoned there. Diggory attempted to reform the system. He proposed better conditions for prisoners, perhaps limiting their exposure to Dementors or finding alternative means of containment. He argued that the current system was cruel beyond necessity, that it served no purpose beyond pure punishment and perhaps revenge. But his efforts met with fierce opposition. Many wizards feared what might happen if the ministry tried to limit the Dementors' access to prisoners. Would the creatures retaliate? Would they leave Azkaban and attack the mainland? There was also, perhaps more cynically, a certain segment of the wizarding population that liked the idea of criminals suffering, that saw value in making punishment as terrible as possible as a deterrent to others. Tragically, Eldritch Diggory died in office from dragonpox before he could implement any of his reforms. His successor, Minister Hephaestus Gore, immediately reversed course. Rather than reforming Azkaban, Gore chose to renovate and reinforce it, making it even more secure, even more terrible. From that point forward, for the next several centuries, no serious opposition arose to the use of Azkaban or the employment of Dementors as guards. The prison became an accepted, if feared, part of wizarding society. It was simply the way things were done. By the time Azkaban reached its modern era, by the time we approach the period in which Harry Potter's story takes place, the prison had been operating for nearly 3 centuries. Generations of wizards and witches had been sent there, had lived and died within its walls. The prison had developed its own grim reputation, its own dark legends. As of the 1730s or 40s, during Diggory's inspection, a graveyard had been established on the island to accommodate those who died in the prison. Most prisoners died of despair, having simply lost the will to live after prolonged exposure to the Dementors. The physical structure of Azkaban itself deserves attention. The fortress is described as imposing and ancient, built of dark stone that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. It sits on a small, rocky island, completely isolated from the mainland. The North Sea around it is cold and treacherous, with strong currents and icy waters that would kill even a strong swimmer within minutes. The island appears on no maps, neither muggle nor magical, protected by powerful unplottable charms that make it impossible to find unless one already knows exactly where it is. The fortress is further protected by anti-apparition jinxes, preventing prisoners from simply teleporting away from the island. Inside the fortress, conditions are as terrible as one might imagine. The cells are small, bare, and cold. Prisoners are not allowed to keep their wands, which are confiscated immediately upon arrival. Indeed, visitors to Azkaban, on the rare occasions when visitors are permitted, must hand over their wands at a security desk at the entrance, ensuring no prisoner can take a wand and use it to escape. Flying devices like broomsticks are also forbidden, left outside in the security entrance. The entire system is designed to make escape impossible, but the physical barriers to escape, the bars and walls and icy waters, are actually not what keeps prisoners in Azkaban. It is the Dementors. Their constant presence saps prisoners of the strength needed to even attempt escape. Most prisoners, within weeks of arrival, lose the ability to think clearly, to plan, to hope. They sit in their cells, reliving their worst memories over and over, slowly losing their grip on sanity and identity. Some go mad immediately. Others take years, but the end result is almost always the same. Only the will to live distinguishes how long a prisoner might last before they either die or completely lose their mind. Throughout its history, Azkaban housed some of the most dangerous criminals in the wizarding world. Before Voldemort's rise to power, before the Death Eaters, there were other dark wizards and witches, murderers and torturers and practitioners of forbidden magic. The prison's reputation grew with each notorious inmate. People spoke of Azkaban in whispers, as a fate worse than death. The phrase, "sent to Azkaban," became synonymous with ultimate punishment, with hopelessness, with the end of all things good in life. But it was during Voldemort's first rise to power, during what became known as the First Wizarding War, that Azkaban truly became filled with some of its most infamous inhabitants. The Death Eaters, Voldemort's followers, committed terrible crimes during this period. They tortured, murdered, and terrorized both muggles and magical folk. They used unforgivable curses freely, killed without remorse, and spread fear throughout the wizarding world. When Voldemort fell in 1981, defeated by the infant Harry Potter, many of his followers were captured and tried for their crimes. The head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement at that time was a wizard named Bartemius Crouch Sr. Crouch was a hard-line authoritarian, determined to crush Voldemort's movement by any means necessary. He authorized the use of unforgivable curses against Death Eaters, fighting fire with fire. He also handed out sentences to many suspects without proper trials, bypassing the normal legal process in his zeal to capture as many Death Eaters as possible. This approach did succeed in catching many guilty people, preventing them from using their wealth and influence to manipulate the courts, but it also resulted in innocent people being imprisoned. Among those sent to Azkaban during this purge were 4 Death Eaters who would become particularly infamous. Their names were Bellatrix Lestrange, her husband Rodolphus Lestrange, his brother Rabastan Lestrange, and a young wizard named Bartemius Crouch Jr. These four were convicted of one of the most heinous crimes of the war. They had captured two Aurors, members of the magical law enforcement, named Frank and Alice Longbottom. The Longbottoms were respected Aurors who had fought bravely against Voldemort's forces. They had personally resisted Voldemort himself on 3 separate occasions and survived, making them targets for Death Eater revenge. After Voldemort's fall, while the Death Eaters were in disarray, Bellatrix Lestrange and her companions sought information about their fallen master's whereabouts. They believed the Longbottoms might know something, might have some clue about where Voldemort had gone, or how he could be restored to power. And so they captured Frank and Alice Longbottom and subjected them to the Cruciatus Curse, the torture curse, one of the 3 unforgivable curses. They tortured the couple brutally and extensively, using the curse over and over, demanding information the Longbottoms did not have. The torture continued until Frank and Alice Longbottom were driven completely insane. Their minds broke under the assault. They lost all sense of who they were, all connection to reality. They did not die, but what remained of them was barely recognizable as human. They were transferred to St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries, where they would spend the rest of their lives in the permanent spell damage ward, unable to recognize even their own son, Neville Longbottom, who would grow up knowing his parents only as the shattered remnants the Death Eaters had left behind. The 4 Death Eaters responsible for this atrocity were caught and put on trial. During the trial, Bellatrix Lestrange showed no remorse whatsoever. Instead, she proudly proclaimed her loyalty to the Dark Lord. She announced that Voldemort would return, that he would reward his faithful followers, that she and the others had remained true to him when others had fled or denied him. Her fanatical devotion was clear to everyone present. The court had no difficulty reaching a verdict. All 4, Bellatrix, Rodolphus, Rabastan, and Barty Crouch Jr., were sentenced to life imprisonment in Azkaban, the harshest sentence available under wizarding law. Bartemius Crouch Sr., who prosecuted the case and had to watch his own son be convicted and sentenced, showed no mercy. He allowed his son to be taken to Azkaban, to be imprisoned alongside the Lestranges, to be subjected to the Dementors' tender care. It seemed like justice had been served. 4 dangerous Death Eaters had been removed from society and locked away where they could harm no one else. But the story of Barty Crouch Jr. would take an unexpected turn. About a year after his imprisonment, around 1982, Crouch Jr.'s mother fell gravely ill. She was dying, and she made a final desperate plea to her husband. She wanted to see their son one more time before she died. Bartemius Crouch Sr., despite his harsh public persona, loved his wife deeply, and so he agreed to a plan that was both brilliant and terrible. He took his dying wife to visit their son in Azkaban, a visit that would be permitted given his position in the ministry. But this was not simply a final goodbye. Mrs. Crouch and her son used Polyjuice Potion to switch appearances. The mother took on her son's appearance and remained in the cell when they left, while Barty Jr., looking like his mother, walked out of Azkaban disguised as a dying woman. Mrs. Crouch died shortly after in Azkaban, in her son's cell, buried under his name in the prison graveyard. The Dementors, who sense human souls rather than see physical appearances, noticed nothing amiss. As far as they were concerned, Barty Crouch Jr. had died and been buried. Meanwhile, the real Barty Crouch Jr. was free. But his freedom was limited. His father kept him prisoner at home, hidden under an invisibility cloak, controlled by the imperious curse to keep him docile. This secret imprisonment would last for years, until eventually Voldemort learned of it and freed his faithful servant. But for many years, no one in the wizarding world knew that Barty Crouch Jr. had escaped. As far as official records showed, he had died in Azkaban, just another casualty of the prison's brutal conditions. This was, technically, the first escape from Azkaban in its history, though it would remain secret for over a decade. While Barty Crouch Jr.'s escape remained hidden, another prisoner in Azkaban was enduring his own nightmare. This prisoner was named Sirius Black, and his case represents one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in wizarding history. Sirius Black was sent to Azkaban in 1981, shortly after Voldemort's fall. He was accused of terrible crimes, betraying James and Lily Potter to Voldemort, leading to their deaths, murdering Peter Pettigrew and 12 Muggles with a single curse, and serving as a Death Eater loyal to the Dark Lord. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Witnesses saw Sirius laughing maniacally at the scene of the crime. Sirius himself did not deny the accusations or attempt to defend himself. He was arrested and, like so many others during that chaotic period, sentenced without receiving a proper trial. But Sirius Black was innocent. The truth of what happened was far more complex and tragic. Sirius had been best friends with James Potter since their school days at Hogwarts. They were like brothers, part of a close-knit group that called themselves the Marauders. When Voldemort targeted the Potters, when it became clear that James and Lily needed to go into hiding, a protective spell called the Fidelius Charm was cast on their location. This charm requires a secret keeper, one person who holds the knowledge of the hidden location. If the secret keeper does not reveal the secret, the hidden location cannot be found by anyone else, even Voldemort himself. The obvious choice for secret keeper was Sirius Black, James Potter's closest friend and Harry's godfather, but Sirius convinced James to use Peter Pettigrew instead. Peter was another member of the Marauders, a friend from school, someone everyone trusted. Sirius argued that Voldemort would expect him to be the secret keeper, would target him immediately. Peter, being less obvious, would be safer. It seemed like a clever plan. It was, in fact, a catastrophic mistake. Because Peter Pettigrew was a traitor. He had secretly joined Voldemort's side, become a Death Eater, and was feeding information to the Dark Lord. When Peter became secret keeper for the Potters' location, he immediately betrayed them. He told Voldemort where they were hiding. Voldemort went to Godric's Hollow, murdered James and Lily Potter, and tried to kill their infant son, Harry, only to be defeated by magic he did not understand when the killing curse rebounded upon him. The next day, Sirius discovered what had happened. He realized that Peter must have been the traitor. Consumed by grief and rage, he went looking for Peter, finally confronting him on a crowded London street. But Peter was clever and ruthless. With Sirius bearing down on him, Peter shouted loud enough for witnesses to hear that Sirius had betrayed the Potters. Then, before Sirius could respond, Peter used his wand to cause a massive explosion, blowing up the street, killing 12 Muggles who happened to be nearby. In the chaos and carnage that followed, Peter cut off his own finger, leaving it behind as evidence of his death, and transformed into his animagus form, a rat, escaping into the sewers before anyone realized what had happened. When Aurors arrived at the scene, they found Sirius standing amid the rubble and bodies, laughing. But Sirius was not laughing from joy or madness, not really. He was laughing at the bitter irony of it all, at the terrible mistake he had made. He had convinced James to trust Peter. He had pushed for Peter to be secret keeper. And now James and Lily were dead. Peter had framed him perfectly, and there was no way to prove the truth. The evidence damned him completely. Everyone believed he was guilty. Sirius was arrested, charged with multiple counts of murder and treason, and sent to Azkaban without a trial. No one listened to his protests. No one investigated further. He was guilty in everyone's eyes, a Death Eater who had betrayed his best friend to Voldemort. And so, Sirius Black entered Azkaban, where he would remain for the next 12 years, knowing he was innocent but unable to prove it, surrounded by Dementors that fed on despair. Most prisoners in Azkaban lost their sanity quickly. The Dementors' constant presence, feeding on happiness and hope, reduced even the strongest minds to broken shells. But Sirius had something most prisoners did not have. He had knowledge of his own innocence. This was not a happy thought, so the Dementors could not drain it from him the way they drained happy memories. Instead, it became a kind of anchor, something solid in the sea of despair that surrounded him. He would cling to this knowledge, repeat it to himself over and over. He was innocent. He did not deserve to be here. He had not betrayed James and Lily. This truth kept him sane, barely, when everyone around him went mad. Sirius had another advantage as well. He was an unregistered animagus, able to transform into a large black dog. This ability was a secret. The Ministry did not know about it. Neither did anyone at Hogwarts except his fellow marauders, and they were either dead or believed him guilty. Sirius discovered that when he transformed into his dog form, the Dementors had difficulty sensing him. Dementors feed on complex human emotions, but animal emotions are simpler, harder for them to detect. In his dog form, Sirius could find brief respites from the constant assault of despair, moments where his mind could rest and recover slightly. But these small advantages, his knowledge of innocence and his secret animagus form, were not enough to give Sirius hope of escape. The fact was, he had no reason to escape. James and Lily were dead. Harry was being cared for, somewhere safe. Somewhere Sirius believed Peter could not reach him. There was nothing Sirius could do on the outside. He had failed his best friend in the worst way possible. Perhaps he deserved to suffer, even if the reasons the world thought he deserved it were wrong. And so, Sirius stayed in Azkaban, year after year, growing thin and haggard, his handsome features wasting away, aging prematurely under the Dementors' influence. Everything changed in the summer of 1993, 12 years after Sirius's imprisonment. The Minister for Magic, Cornelius Fudge, came to Azkaban for an inspection tour. During this visit, as a courtesy, Fudge gave Sirius his copy of the Daily Prophet, the Wizarding newspaper. Normally, this would have been a small kindness, a brief distraction for a prisoner from the monotony of despair. But in this particular newspaper was a photograph that changed everything. The photograph showed the Weasley family on vacation in Egypt. Arthur Weasley had won a prize in a Daily Prophet drawing, and the family had used the money for a trip abroad. The photo showed the entire family, including their children, one of whom, Ron Weasley, was holding his pet rat on his shoulder. And Sirius, looking at this photograph, recognized the rat, because magical photographs move in the wizarding world, because the rat was clearly visible and identifiable, and because Sirius had known Peter Pettigrew for years. He recognized his old friend in his animagus form. Peter Pettigrew was alive. Peter Pettigrew had been hiding as a pet rat for 12 years, living with a wizarding family, and he was about to return to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, because Ron Weasley was a student there. More importantly, Harry Potter was also a student at Hogwarts. Harry, the son of James and Lily, the boy Sirius had sworn to protect as his godfather, was at Hogwarts, and Peter Pettigrew was there with him. Suddenly, Sirius had a reason to escape. Suddenly, his knowledge of his own innocence was not enough. He needed to get to Hogwarts. He needed to warn Harry. He needed to expose Peter. He needed to finally, after 12 years, get justice for James and Lily. This obsession gave him something the Dementors could not take away. It gave him clarity, focus, a goal that burned in his mind like a fire. It was not a happy thought, but it gave him strength. One night, when the Dementors opened his cell door to bring food, Sirius transformed into his dog form. The Dementors were confused by the sudden shift to animal emotions, distracted just long enough for him to slip past them. He was extremely thin by this point, malnourished after 12 years of minimal food and constant despair. This worked in his favor. In his dog form, he was thin enough to squeeze through the bars of his cell. He made it to the edge of the fortress and dove into the icy North Sea. The swim should have killed him. The water was freezing, the currents treacherous, the distance to the mainland enormous. But Sirius was determined, sustained by his obsession, and in his dog form, he was a strong swimmer. He made it to shore, traveling as a dog to avoid detection, and began the long journey north to Scotland, to Hogwarts. He had no wand, no money, no resources of any kind. He was skeletal thin, barely recognizable as human, when he occasionally shifted back to his human form. But he reached Hogwarts and hid in the Forbidden Forest, living as a dog, watching over Harry from a distance, waiting for his chance to confront Peter. The news of Sirius Black's escape caused panic throughout the wizarding world. He was, as far as anyone knew, a mass murderer and dangerous Death Eater. The Ministry deployed Dementors to search for him, placing them at all entrances to Hogwarts to prevent him from entering the school. The Daily Prophet ran story after story about the dangerous prisoner on the loose. People were terrified. And through it all, the Ministry could not understand how Sirius had escaped. No one had ever escaped from Azkaban before, at least as far as they knew. The Dementors were supposed to make escape impossible. How had he done it? The truth, which would not be revealed until later, was that Sirius had 3 advantages. First, his knowledge of his innocence kept him sane when others would have gone mad. Second, his unregistered animagus form allowed him to slip past the Dementors. And third, he had a powerful motivation, a reason to risk death by escaping, a goal that gave him the strength to attempt the impossible. Without all 3 of these factors, he never would have succeeded. Sirius Black's escape represented a turning point in Azkaban's history. For nearly 300 years, the prison had maintained a perfect record. No one had ever escaped, at least not publicly. The Ministry had pointed to this as proof of Azkaban's effectiveness, justification for the continued use of Dementors as guards. But now that record was broken. Questions began to arise. If one prisoner could escape, could others? Were the Dementors as effective as everyone believed? What did this mean for the security of the wizarding world? The Ministry's response was to increase security, to deploy even more Dementors in the search for Sirius Black. They placed Dementors around Hogwarts, supposedly to protect the students from the dangerous escaped prisoner, though in reality, this decision would cause more problems than it solved. The Dementors affected everyone at Hogwarts, not just searching for Sirius. Students felt their presence, experienced the cold and despair that radiated from these creatures. Harry Potter, in particular, was deeply affected by them, more so than anyone else, because the Dementors forced him to relive his worst memory, the night his parents were murdered. Eventually, the truth about Sirius Black came out. In a confrontation at Hogwarts involving Harry, his friends Ron and Hermione, Sirius himself and Remus Lupin, who had been one of the Marauders and remembered the truth about Peter Pettigrew, was finally exposed. He was forced to transform back into his human form, revealed as the traitor he had always been. Sirius was proven innocent, but in the chaos that followed, involving a werewolf transformation and an attack by Dementors, Peter managed to escape again. Without Peter's testimony, without concrete proof, the Ministry refused to believe Sirius was innocent. As far as the official record was concerned, Sirius Black remained a wanted criminal, though those who knew the truth worked to protect him. Sirius would spend the next few years in hiding, unable to clear his name publicly, living on the run. He eventually took up residence at his family's old home in London, Grimmauld Place, which became the headquarters for the Order of the Phoenix, the organization fighting against Voldemort after his return. Sirius never got to experience true freedom again. He died in 1996, killed by his cousin Bellatrix Lestrange during a battle at the Ministry of Magic. Only after his death would his name be quietly cleared in official records, though the public never learned the full truth of his innocence. The story of Sirius Black highlighted one of Azkaban's greatest problems. The prison did not merely contain guilty prisoners, because Bartemius Crouch Sr. had sent so many people to Azkaban without trials during the First Wizarding War, because the system valued quick punishment over careful justice. Innocent people had been imprisoned alongside the guilty, and once someone entered Azkaban, once the Dementors began their work, it became almost impossible to prove innocence. The despair, the madness, the loss of clarity and hope, all conspired to keep the innocent trapped just as surely as the guilty. But Sirius Black was not the only notable prisoner in Azkaban during this period. The Lestranges remained imprisoned, serving their life sentences for the torture of the Longbottoms. Bellatrix Lestrange, in particular, was a model prisoner in the worst possible way. She did not resist. She did not attempt escape. She simply waited, convinced that her Dark Lord would return and reward her faithfulness. Her devotion to Voldemort bordered on obsession, perhaps even romantic love, though Voldemort himself was incapable of returning such feelings. For 14 years, she endured Azkaban, her beauty fading, her appearance becoming gaunt and wild, but her fanatic loyalty never wavering. Other Death Eaters were imprisoned as well. Augustus Rookwood, who had been a spy within the Ministry. Antonin Dolohov, a brutal killer who had murdered many during the war. Numerous others whose names appeared in Ministry records, all of them dangerous, all of them loyal to Voldemort, all of them waiting in their cells, while the Dementors slowly destroyed what remained of their humanity. Some of these prisoners went mad, some died, but some, like Bellatrix, survived through sheer force of will, clinging to their dark beliefs, to their memories of serving the Dark Lord, to their hatred of those who had imprisoned them. When Voldemort returned to power in June of 1995, reborn through dark magic and the sacrifice of his servant, one of his first priorities was freeing his followers from Azkaban. He knew they remained loyal to him. He knew they were waiting. And he had a powerful advantage. The Dementors, despite their employment by the Ministry of Magic, were not truly loyal to anyone. They served whoever allowed them to feed, whoever gave them access to human prey. Voldemort could offer them something the Ministry never could. He could offer them freedom to feed wherever they wished, freedom to spread despair and terror across the entire country, not just within the confines of a single prison. for creatures that fed on human happiness. This was an irresistible offer. The Ministry of Magic at this time was in a state of denial. The minister, Cornelius Fudge, refused to believe that Voldemort had returned. Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore insisted it was true, warned of the danger, but Fudge dismissed their claims as lies or delusions. He spent months running a propaganda campaign to discredit them, to convince the wizarding public that there was no threat, that everything was fine. This willful blindness left the ministry unprepared for what was coming. In January of 1996, Voldemort made his move. The Dementors, who had been growing restless with ministry control, who had been seeking more freedom to feed, abandoned their posts at Azkaban. They joined Voldemort, becoming his allies in the coming war. And with the Dementors gone, with the primary security of Azkaban suddenly absent, 10 of the most dangerous prisoners in the facility simply walked out. It was a mass breakout, the first in Azkaban's history, and it shocked the wizarding world. Among the escapees were Bellatrix Lestrange and her husband Rodolphus, along with his brother Rabastan. Antonin Dolohov, the murderer, was freed. Augustus Rookwood, the spy, and 6 others, all Death Eaters, all dangerous, all immediately returning to Voldemort's service. These were not random prisoners. These were members of Voldemort's inner circle, the most loyal and ruthless of his followers. They had spent 14 years in Azkaban, 14 years enduring the Dementors, and they emerged even more dangerous than when they entered, hardened by suffering, driven by revenge, fanatically devoted to their master. The ministry tried to cover up the true nature of the breakout. They could not admit that the Dementors had betrayed them, that Voldemort was real and powerful enough to command such loyalty from the prison guards. Instead, they blamed Sirius Black. The Daily Prophet ran stories suggesting that Sirius, having escaped years earlier, had somehow returned to free his cousin Bellatrix and the other prisoners. It was a transparent lie, one that many people saw through, but the ministry clung to it desperately, unwilling to face the truth. The mass breakout marked the beginning of the end for Azkaban, as it had existed for nearly 3 centuries. Within months, the truth became undeniable. Voldemort was back. The Dementors had joined him. The war, the Second Wizarding War, had begun, and Azkaban was no longer under ministry control. Several of the escaped Death Eaters participated in the Battle of the Department of Mysteries in June of 1996, an attempt to steal a prophecy concerning Harry Potter and Voldemort. During this battle, which took place in the Ministry of Magic itself, Cornelius Fudge and many ministry officials witnessed Voldemort with their own eyes. They could no longer deny his return. After the battle, most of the escaped Death Eaters were recaptured and returned to Azkaban, but not all of them. Bellatrix Lestrange escaped with Voldemort, disapparating from the Ministry atrium after a duel with Dumbledore himself. She would remain free for the rest of the war, serving as Voldemort's most trusted lieutenant, participating in numerous battles and murders. The brief period of her recapture had ended, and now she was loose in the world again, more dangerous than ever. Meanwhile, Azkaban itself had become compromised. The Dementors were gone, having fully sided with Voldemort. The fortress stood empty of guards, still containing prisoners, but with no effective way to keep them contained. Some prisoners remained simply because they had nowhere else to go, because years in Azkaban had broken them so thoroughly that escape held no appeal. But others began to slip away. Security was non-existent. The ministry, overwhelmed by the larger war, had little resources to dedicate to maintaining the prison. In the summer of 1997, there was another mass breakout, this one larger than the first. All the Death Eaters who had been recaptured after the Department of Mysteries battle escaped again, along with many others. The Ministry tried to hush this up to prevent panic, but word spread anyway. Kingsley Shacklebolt, an Auror and member of the Order of the Phoenix, confirmed that there had been a mass breakout that the Ministry was trying to hide. Azkaban had essentially ceased to function as a prison. Voldemort controlled access to it. He freed his followers at will. The Ministry could do nothing to stop him. This state of affairs continued throughout the Second Wizarding War. Azkaban became a symbol of Ministry failure, of the consequences of relying on creatures like Dementors to do work that should have been done by witches and wizards. The Dementors themselves became weapons in Voldemort's arsenal. They spread out across Britain, breeding and multiplying, as the Minister for Magic noted, causing unseasonable fog and gloom, feeding on muggles and wizards alike, spreading terror wherever they went. Their presence could be felt in the atmosphere itself, a cold, creeping despair that affected everyone, even those who could not see the creatures. During this period, Azkaban was also used to imprison people who opposed the Voldemort-controlled Ministry that took power after Voldemort's coup. Muggle-born wizards and witches accused of stealing magic were sent to Azkaban to await trial, trials that would never come. The prison became a tool of oppression, a way to dispose of anyone deemed undesirable by the new regime. Among those imprisoned during this time was Dirk Cresswell, who eventually managed to escape and went on the run rather than face the sham trial awaiting him. The war finally ended in May of 1998, when Harry Potter defeated Voldemort in a final confrontation at Hogwarts. Voldemort was destroyed, his Horcruxes all destroyed, his body killed by his own rebounding curse. His Death Eaters were defeated, killed, or captured. The Dementors, who had allied with the losing side, scattered, and the Ministry of Magic, under new leadership, finally had to confront the question of what to do with Azkaban. The new Minister for Magic was Kingsley Shacklebolt, an Auror who had fought with the Order of the Phoenix throughout the war. Shacklebolt was determined to reform the Ministry, to correct the mistakes and corruption that had allowed Voldemort to nearly succeed in his takeover. And one of his first priorities was Azkaban. The prison, as it had existed for 3 centuries, was unacceptable. The use of Dementors as guards had been a terrible mistake from the beginning. It had to end. Shacklebolt's reforms were comprehensive and far-reaching. First, and most importantly, the Dementors were permanently removed from Azkaban. They would no longer serve as prison guards. They would no longer have access to prisoners to feed upon. The Ministry's official position was that Dementors could not be destroyed, that they were simply too powerful and too difficult to kill. This may have been true, or it may have been convenient, a way to avoid the difficult question of what to do with creatures that had caused so much suffering. Either way, the Jarl Dementors were banished to remote areas, far from human populations, where they could be monitored and contained. In place of the Dementors, Shacklebolt appointed Aurors to serve as guards at Azkaban. These were trained witches and wizards, law enforcement professionals who understood security and who could be held accountable for their actions. The fortress itself was renovated. The dark magic that had seeped into its stones gradually cleansed through the efforts of skilled curse breakers and magical architects. New wards were put in place, anti-apparition jinxes strengthened, physical security improved. The goal was to create a prison that could contain dangerous criminals without destroying their minds and souls in the process. Other reforms followed. The Ministry instituted stricter oversight of the judicial system. ensuring that prisoners received proper trials before being sentenced. The practice of imprisoning people without trial, which had been common during both Wizarding Wars, was officially condemned and procedures put in place to prevent it from happening again. Conditions for prisoners were improved, with better food, access to exercise, and limits on how long prisoners could be held in solitary confinement. The focus shifted from pure punishment to containment and, where possible, eventual rehabilitation and reintegration into Wizarding society. These reforms were not without controversy. Many in the Wizarding community believed that dangerous criminals deserved harsh punishment, that Death Eaters in particular should suffer for their crimes. There were arguments that removing the Dementors made escape more likely, that Aura guards could be bribed or overcome in ways that Dementors could not. Some people worried that the Dementors, no longer confined to Azkaban, might pose a greater threat to society at large. Others questioned whether the Ministry had the resources to adequately guard Azkaban without Dementors, whether the reforms were financially sustainable. But Shacklebolt stood firm. The old system had been fundamentally unjust, fundamentally cruel. It had failed during the war, completely and utterly. The Dementors had proven unreliable, had switched sides as soon as someone offered them better terms. They could not be trusted. More importantly, their use as guards violated basic principles of justice and human dignity. The new system might not be perfect, but it was an improvement, a step toward a more just Wizarding society. As the years passed after the war, as the Wizarding world slowly healed and rebuilt, reports began to emerge from Azkaban that suggested the fortress itself retained some of its dark nature despite the reforms. Current prisoners, even with the Dementors gone, reported experiencing nightmares, hearing whispers in the walls, feeling unexplained cold spots throughout the facility. The renovation efforts had helped, but they could not completely erase 600 years of dark magic and human suffering. The very stones of Azkaban seemed steeped in misery, as if the fortress itself had absorbed the despair of generations of prisoners and could not fully release it. This raised troubling questions about the nature of dark magic and whether places could be truly cleansed once they had been so thoroughly corrupted. Ekrizdis had built the fortress with dark magic, had saturated it with suffering and death for decades, or perhaps centuries. Then the Dementors had lived there for hundreds of years, feeding constantly on human misery, breeding in the darkness. Could such a place ever be made truly safe? Could it ever be anything other than a source of horror and despair? Some magical theorists argued that Azkaban should be abandoned entirely, that a new prison should be built elsewhere on clean ground, free from the taint of dark history. But this proposal faced practical obstacles. Building a new facility would be expensive. It would take years, and there was no guarantee that a new prison would be any better, that it would not eventually develop its own dark history. At least with Azkaban, everyone knew what they were dealing with. The darkness was acknowledged, addressed as much as possible, monitored continuously. Perhaps that transparency was better than starting fresh and risking the same mistakes. The question of what to do with the Dementors themselves remained unresolved. The Ministry maintained that they could not be destroyed, but this claim was never tested rigorously. Perhaps it was true that Dementors, as immortal beings that had never been truly alive, could not be killed in any conventional sense. Or perhaps the Ministry simply did not want to make the attempt, feared what might happen if they tried and failed. The Dementors were relegated to remote areas, supposedly contained and monitored, but they continued to exist. They continued to breed. and many people wondered whether keeping such creatures around, even in isolated locations, was wise. If they had switched allegiance once, if they had joined Voldemort when he offered them better terms, what would prevent them from doing so again if another dark wizard rose to power? Critics of the Ministry's policy pointed out that the existence of Dementors represented a kind of standing threat, a weapon waiting to be used by whoever could offer them the most prey. As long as Dementors existed, as long as they needed to feed on human happiness to survive, they would be a danger. Some suggested that intensive magical research should be conducted to find a way to destroy them, or at least neutralize their feeding requirement. Others proposed that the Dementors should be banished to some remote dimension or pocket of space where they could not interact with humans at all. But these proposals required resources and political will that the post-war ministry did not have. There were too many other priorities, too many other things that needed attention and funding. And so the Dementors remained, a dark presence lurking at the edges of wizarding society, a reminder of past mistakes and potential future dangers. Their very existence served as a warning about the consequences of trying to use dark creatures as tools, of believing that evil could be controlled and directed toward useful ends. The Dementors had proven that such creatures ultimately served only themselves, only their own hunger, and would align with whoever could best satisfy that hunger regardless of morality or justice. The legacy of Azkaban extends far beyond the physical prison itself. For generations of witches and wizards, the mere mention of Azkaban evoked terror. It became synonymous with ultimate punishment, with hopelessness, with the complete destruction of everything that made life worth living. Parents used it as a threat to frighten disobedient children. Adults spoke of it in whispers, afraid that even discussing it might somehow invite its attention. The cultural impact of Azkaban shaped how wizarding society thought about crime, punishment, justice, and the limits of what was acceptable in the name of security. The prison also highlighted fundamental questions about the nature of justice itself. What is the purpose of imprisonment? Is it purely punishment, revenge for crimes committed? Is it rehabilitation, an attempt to reform criminals and return them to society as productive members? Is it simply containment, keeping dangerous people away from those they might harm? Different societies answer these questions differently, and the wizarding world's answer for 3 centuries was punishment. Azkaban was designed to make prisoners suffer, to break them down, to ensure that every moment of their sentence was as terrible as possible. This approach had consequences that extended beyond the prisoners themselves. It brutalized the society that employed it. It normalized cruelty. It created a system where injustices like Sirius Black's imprisonment could occur and persist for years without investigation or correction. It made wizarding society complicit in torture, because that is what prolonged exposure to Dementors was, a form of torture that destroyed minds and souls. The fact that this torture was legal, that it was official ministry policy, that it was accepted by most of the wizarding community, revealed something dark about that society's values and priorities. The cases of individual prisoners illustrated these systemic problems in human terms. Sirius Black, innocent but imprisoned without trial, spending 12 years in hell for crimes he did not commit. Hagrid, sent to Azkaban on suspicion of opening the Chamber of Secrets, held without trial for weeks in 1992, released only when his innocence was proven through external events, rather than any investigation or legal process. Morfin Gaunt, who confessed to murders he did not commit after Voldemort planted false memories in his mind, died in Azkaban, believing himself guilty. These were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a broken system, a justice system that prioritized speed and convenience over accuracy and fairness. But there were also prisoners who genuinely deserved imprisonment, who had committed terrible crimes and posed real dangers to society. Bellatrix Lestrange tortured the Longbottoms into insanity. Antonin Dolohov murdered numerous people during both wars. These were not misunderstood individuals or victims of circumstance. They were dangerous criminals who had chosen to cause suffering, who had enjoyed causing suffering, who would do so again if given the opportunity. Society needed some way to protect itself from such people. The question was whether that protection required the level of cruelty that Azkaban represented. The reforms instituted after the Second Wizarding War attempted to find a balance. Dangerous criminals would still be imprisoned. They would be kept away from society, prevented from causing further harm. But they would not be subjected to soul-destroying torture. They would be treated as human beings, even if they had behaved monstrously. This approach was not about being soft on crime or excusing evil acts. It was about maintaining society's own moral integrity, about refusing to become as cruel as the criminals being punished. Whether these reforms have been successful remains an open question in the wizarding world. Azkaban still stands. Prisoners are still sent there. The fortress still carries the weight of its dark history. But the Dementors are gone, replaced by aura guards who can be held accountable for their actions. Prisoners receive trials. Conditions are better, though far from pleasant. It is an improvement, though perhaps not as much of an improvement as some had hoped for when the war ended. The physical location of Azkaban, that isolated island in the North Sea, continues to serve its grim purpose. The journey to the prison is difficult and unpleasant. Visitors, on the rare occasions when visits are permitted, must travel by authorized boat through cold and choppy waters, approaching the dark fortress that rises from the sea like a monument to suffering. The island itself offers no comfort, no beauty, nothing but the prison and the memories of all who have suffered there. Inside the renovated fortress, the layout remains much as it always was. Cells line corridor after corridor, small rooms with minimal furnishings, designed for containment rather than comfort. The dungeons, built below sea level, are cold and damp despite magical heating charms. The higher levels are marginally better, but still oppressive, with narrow windows that offer views only of grey water and clouded sky. The common areas, where prisoners are allowed to gather for meals and limited recreation, are carefully monitored by aura guards who maintain constant vigilance. The daily routine of life in modern Azkaban is monotonous and carefully structured. Prisoners wake at dawn, eat a simple breakfast, then spend their days in assigned work details. Educational programs for those who show potential for rehabilitation, or simply confined to their cells if deemed too dangerous to mix with the general population. Meals are adequate but plain. Recreation is limited. Contact with the outside world is minimal, restricted to occasional letters and even rarer visits from family members who have not abandoned them. For the auras who serve as guards, the work is challenging and often depressing. They see the worst of wizarding society, deal with dangerous and sometimes unstable prisoners, and work in an environment that remains oppressive despite the absence of Dementors. The fortress itself, with its history and its lingering dark magic, affects everyone who spends time there. Guard rotations are kept deliberately short to prevent the long-term psychological effects that can result from prolonged exposure to Azkaban's atmosphere. Counseling and support services are provided for auras who work there. Recognition of the toll the job takes. Among the remaining prisoners in post-war Azkaban are various captured Death Eaters who survived the final battle. Some expressed remorse for their crimes and received lighter sentences. Others remained unrepentant and will likely spend the rest of their lives imprisoned. There are also prisoners convicted of other serious crimes, murders, torture, dangerous use of dark magic, assault with intent to kill. The prison's population is smaller than it was during the height of Voldemort's first reign, a reflection of both more careful judicial processes and a general decline in serious magical crime following the war. The question of what happens to prisoners after they serve their sentences, assuming they are not imprisoned for life, remains complicated. Reintegration into wizarding society is difficult for anyone with a criminal record, but especially for those who served time in Azkaban. The stigma attached to having been imprisoned there is enormous. Former prisoners often find that no one will hire them, that old friends and family members want nothing to do with them, that they are viewed with suspicion and fear wherever they go. Some manage to rebuild their lives through determination and the support of the few who are willing to give them a chance. Others fall back into crime, unable to find legitimate ways to survive in a society that has rejected them. The wizarding world's understanding of mental health and psychological trauma has improved somewhat in the post-war years, partly because of the recognition that Azkaban's effects extended beyond physical imprisonment. Studies have been conducted on former prisoners, documenting the long-term damage caused by exposure to Dementors. The findings were disturbing. Even prisoners who spent relatively short periods in Azkaban, weeks or months rather than years, showed lasting psychological effects. Depression, anxiety, difficulty experiencing positive emotions, intrusive memories, nightmares, all of these were common. For prisoners who spent years or decades there, the damage was often permanent and severe. Sirius Black, during the brief period between his escape and his death, exhibited many of these symptoms. His appearance had been ravaged by his time in prison, and while he regained some weight and healthier coloring during his time in hiding, he never fully recovered. He struggled with depression, with feelings of worthlessness and guilt, with rage at the injustice he had suffered. His imprisonment had stolen 12 years of his life, had taken him from a young man in his early 20s to a gaunt, haunted figure in his 30s who looked even older. Those years could never be returned. The damage could never be fully repaired. His case also illustrated another aspect of Azkaban's legacy, the impact on families. Harry Potter grew up not knowing his godfather, believing him to be a dangerous criminal. When he learned the truth, when he and Sirius finally connected, they had so little time together before Sirius's death. The relationship they should have had, that Sirius and James had planned for when they made Sirius Harry's godfather, was stolen by Azkaban. Neville Longbottom grew up with parents who could not recognize him, destroyed by the torture inflicted by prisoners who were then sent to Azkaban. The ripples of suffering spread far beyond the prison walls, affecting innocent people who had committed no crimes, but who lost family members, either to Azkaban itself or to the criminals who were imprisoned there. The broader cultural legacy of Azkaban in wizarding society includes a deep-seated fear of governmental overreach and abuse of power. The ease with which innocent people were sent to Azkaban during times of crisis, the lack of oversight and accountability, the acceptance of torture as standard practice, all of these things shook public confidence in magical government. The reforms instituted after the war were, in part, a response to this loss of confidence, an attempt to rebuild trust by demonstrating that the ministry could learn from its mistakes and implement meaningful change. But skepticism remains. Many wizards and witches question whether the reforms go far enough, whether the fundamental problems with Azkaban have truly been addressed or merely papered over. There are calls for even more radical changes, for abolishing Azkaban entirely and creating a completely new approach to dealing with dangerous criminals. Some suggest that magical means of rehabilitation should be explored more thoroughly, that memory modification or behavioral charms might offer alternatives to long-term imprisonment. Others argue that such approaches would be even more ethically problematic than Azkaban, that tampering with someone's mind and personality is a violation of their essential humanity, even if done with good intentions. These debates continue in the wizarding press, in discussions at the ministry, in classrooms at Hogwarts where students study the history of magical law and justice. Azkaban serves as a case study in how societies can go wrong, how fear and anger can lead to the acceptance of cruelty, how systems designed to protect can become instruments of oppression. The fortress still stands, still functions, still houses prisoners, but its meaning has changed. It is no longer simply a prison. It is a memorial to past mistakes, a warning about future dangers, a reminder that justice must be tempered with mercy if it is to remain just. The symbolism of Azkaban extends into magical culture in other ways as well. In literature and art, Azkaban represents ultimate punishment, inescapable fate, the consequences of evil choices. In children's stories, the threat of being sent to Azkaban serves as a warning against dark magic and serious wrongdoing. In political discourse, comparisons to Azkaban are used to criticize harsh policies or authoritarian measures. The fortress has become a metaphor, shorthand for systematic cruelty, for the dangers of allowing fear to override compassion. For those who work in magical law enforcement and criminal justice, Azkaban represents both a practical necessity and an ethical challenge. How do you protect society from dangerous individuals without becoming cruel yourself? How do you balance security with human rights? How do you ensure that punishment remains just, that it serves a legitimate purpose rather than simply satisfying a desire for revenge? These questions have no easy answers, and Azkaban's history demonstrates the terrible consequences of getting them wrong. The fortress in the North Sea, that dark structure rising from cold waters, will likely continue to serve as Wizarding Britain's primary prison for the foreseeable future. The reforms have made it less terrible than it once was, but it remains a grim place, a place where freedom is lost and hope is hard to maintain. For the prisoners confined there, time moves slowly. Days blend together in monotonous routine. The world outside continues without them. And always, there is the weight of the building itself, the sense of all those who came before, the accumulated suffering of 6 centuries pressing down like a physical force. For the wizarding world at large, Azkaban serves as a reminder that the fight against dark magic and dark wizards is not simply about defeating external enemies. It is also about maintaining one's own moral integrity, about refusing to use evil methods in pursuit of good ends, about remembering that how we treat even the worst among us reflects who we are as a society. The decision to remove the Dementors, to reform the prison, to treat prisoners as human beings worthy of basic dignity, was a statement about values, about the kind of world wizards and witches wanted to create in the aftermath of Voldemort's defeat. As we reflect on Azkaban's complete history, from Ekrizdis' dark fortress, to the Ministry's prison, to the reformed institution of the modern era, certain patterns emerge. Power without accountability leads to abuse. Fear without wisdom leads to cruelty. Justice without mercy becomes vengeance. These lessons, learned at terrible cost over 6 centuries, remain relevant not just to the magical world, but to any society that must grapple with questions of crime and punishment, security and freedom, justice and compassion. The dark legacy of Azkaban cannot be erased. Too many people suffered there. Too many lives were destroyed. Too many innocent people were imprisoned. Too many guilty people were tortured beyond what any crime could justify. The reforms, welcome as they are, cannot undo the past, but they can shape the future. They can ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated, that future generations learn from history rather than being condemned to repeat it. And so Azkaban stands, a fortress on an island in the North Sea, a place of punishment and containment, a symbol of both society's worst impulses and its capacity for reform. The Dementors are gone, but the memories remain. The building itself, dark and imposing, will likely endure for centuries more, a reminder of where the wizarding world has been and a challenge to do better, to be better, to create a system of justice that protects without destroying, that punishes without torture, that maintains security without sacrificing the values that make life worth living. As the waves crash against the rocky shores of that isolated island, as the wind howls around the fortress walls, as prisoners in their cells count the days until their sentences end or until death releases them, Azkaban continues its grim function. But it does so now with at least some measure of oversight, some acknowledgement that even those who have done terrible things retain some spark of humanity that deserves recognition. It is not perfect. It may never be perfect, but it is perhaps better than it was. And in the history of institutions built on cruelty and suffering, better is no small achievement. The complete story of Azkaban, from its origins in dark magic to its modern reformed state, is a story about the choices societies make, about what they value, what they fear, what they are willing to do in the name of security, about the price of justice and the cost of revenge, about whether it is possible to maintain one's humanity while dealing with those who have abandoned theirs. These are not easy questions. The answers, such as they are, have been written in the suffering of generations of prisoners, in the courage of those who fought for reform, in the ongoing work of creating a more just world. And now, dear traveller, as we close this chapter on one of the darkest places in wizarding history, take with you these lessons learned from Azkaban's terrible legacy. Remember that systems of power must be questioned, that authority without accountability leads to abuse, that fear makes poor policy. Remember that mercy is not weakness, that justice should seek to heal rather than simply to harm, that even the worst among us retains some measure of humanity. And remember that change is possible, that even institutions as terrible as Azkaban was can be reformed when enough people demand it, when society collectively decides that there must be a better way. The fortress still stands in the North Sea, dark against the grey sky, waves crashing against its foundations. But the Dementors are gone, and perhaps, in time, even the shadows of the past can be lightened by the hope that future generations will learn from these hard lessons, will create systems of justice that protect without destroying, that punish without torture, that remember always that how we treat even the worst among us defines who we are. If you enjoyed this deep exploration into the magical world, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more cozy lore and bedtime stories. Until next time, sleep well, dream peacefully, and may your mind find rest in these tales of magic and history.